Saturday, 17 December 1944, opened under grey winter sky in Western Europe, as World War II entered one of its most violent and morally complex phases, with American forces locked in desperate fighting during the German Ardennes counteroffensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, where confusion, fear, and brutality collided at the front lines and tested not only tactical skill, but the ethical limits of soldiers under extreme pressure. The context for what George S. Patton would soon confront was shaped by weeks of relentless combat, freezing temperatures, and a rapidly shifting battlefield where German SS units operated with a reputation for fanaticism, and American troops were absorbing reports of massacres of prisoners, including the killing of captured GIs near Malmedy, which spread rapidly through Allied ranks and hardened attitudes towards surrendering enemy forces. Within this atmosphere, American infantrymen faced SS guards who were often younger, ideologically hardened, and trained to resist capture, creating a volatile environment where the boundaries between lawful combat and unlawful retribution became dangerously thin, especially as units struggled to maintain discipline amid exhaustion and constant threat during World War II. The incident that would later reach Patton's attention involved the execution of approximately 50 German SS prisoners by American soldiers following intense combat, an act that occurred not as part of a formal order but within the chaos of frontline fighting, where command control was often fragmented and decisions were made in moments charged with fear, anger, and a desire for survival. Reports of the killings filtered upward through the chain of command in an uneven manner, reflecting the realities of wartime communication, where rumors, partial accounts, and delayed confirmations were common, and where commanders often learned of serious incidents days after they occurred, particularly during high-tempo operations like those Patton was directing in World War II. Patton, commanding Third Army at the time, was known for his aggressive leadership style, strict expectations of discipline, and deep belief in military order, even as he demanded relentless offensive action from his troops, a combination that made his response to allegations of prisoner executions both consequential and closely watched by his subordinates. When Patton became aware that American soldiers under his broader command had executed SS prisoners, his reaction was shaped by multiple forces, including his personal code of honor, his understanding of the laws of war, his concern for operational momentum, and his acute awareness of how such incidents could affect Allied legitimacy in World War II. Patton's private writings reveal a commander deeply conscious of reputation, both his own and that of the United States Army, and he understood that confirmed war crimes, even against a hated enemy, could undermine moral authority, provide propaganda to Germany, and complicate relations with Allied partners who were already navigating complex political terrain. At the same time, Patton was not detached from the emotional reality of the front, and he acknowledged, at least privately, the strain placed on soldiers who had seen comrades murdered and who believed the SS did not adhere to the same rules of war, a belief reinforced by repeated intelligence reports throughout World War II. Rather than issuing public condemnation or dramatic punishment, Patton approached the situation through controlled internal channels, emphasizing the need to maintain discipline without halting combat operations, reflecting his priority of defeating the German offensive while preventing the erosion of command authority. Patton instructed subordinate commanders to investigate quietly, gather facts, and ensure that any confirmed violations were addressed in a manner that reinforced discipline, but he was also careful not to trigger widespread courts-martial that could destabilize frontline units already under extreme stress. This approach reflected a broader Allied pattern during World War II, where commanders often balanced enforcement of military law with the practical realities of sustained combat, particularly during moments when operational success depended on unit cohesion and morale. Patton's stance did not amount to approval of the executions, but neither did it result in highly visible punishment, illustrating the tension between ideal conduct and battlefield reality that characterized many command decisions during World War II. In his correspondence and diary entries, Patton expressed frustration with what he saw as hypocrisy in warfare, noting that the same enemy demanding legal protections had committed atrocities against civilians and prisoners, a sentiment common among frontline officers, though not officially endorsed. Despite these views, Patton reaffirmed to his commanders that prisoners were to be treated according to the rules of war, not out of sympathy for the enemy, but because discipline and control were essential to maintaining an effective army capable of sustained operations in World War II. The handling of the incident also reflected American concern about post-war accountability, as Allied leaders were already anticipating tribunals and legal scrutiny of wartime actions, making it imperative that the U.S. Army could demonstrate an institutional commitment to lawful conduct. Patton's response was therefore shaped not only by immediate tactical concerns, but by a longer strategic view of how World War II would be judged, remembered, and legally evaluated once the fighting ended. The soldiers involved were not elevated as heroes, nor were they publicly denounced, instead fading into the larger mass of wartime anonymity, their actions absorbed into the unrecorded margins of history where countless similar incidents occurred across all armies. This outcome reveals how World War II forced commanders to operate in morally gray spaces, where enforcing absolute standards could weaken combat effectiveness, while ignoring violations entirely could corrode the very structure that made armies function. Patton's decision-making in this instance aligned with his broader command philosophy, which emphasized winning decisively while maintaining internal order, even when that order was imperfect and strained by the realities of mechanized, industrial-scale warfare. The incident also underscores the difference between official policy and lived experience during World War II, where soldiers on the ground often acted based on immediate threat perceptions rather than abstract legal frameworks. For historians, Patton's response provides insight into how Allied commanders navigated incidents of misconduct without derailing critical operations, especially during pivotal moments like the Battle of the Bulge, when defeat carried global consequences. The episode challenges simplified narratives of World War II as a purely moral struggle, instead revealing a conflict where ethical lines were repeatedly tested, bent, and sometimes crossed under extraordinary pressure. Patton's leadership illustrates how authority functioned less through public punishment and more through controlled messaging, reinforcing standards while avoiding actions that could fracture units or slow the offensive. This method did not resolve the underlying moral questions, but it reflected the harsh reality that World War II was fought by human beings operating at the limits of endurance, judgment, and emotional control. The incident also highlights how SS units, by cultivating a reputation for brutality, contributed indirectly to reciprocal violence, creating cycles of fear and retaliation that commanders like Patton struggled to contain. Within Third Army, the priority remained breaking the German advance and restoring Allied momentum, a task Patton executed with speed and coordination that would later become legendary within World War II history. The handling of the executions did not become a defining public controversy during the war, but it remains a significant case study for understanding how military justice functioned under extreme conditions. Patton's actions reveal neither indifference nor moral absolutism, but a pragmatic effort to preserve combat effectiveness while signaling that certain boundaries still mattered, even amid chaos. As World War II continued toward its conclusion, incidents like this contributed to evolving discussions about command responsibility, individual accountability, and the limits of obedience under stress. The silence surrounding the event for decades reflects broader patterns of post-war memory, where uncomfortable truths were often overshadowed by narratives of victory and sacrifice. Yet examining such moments provides a more complete understanding of World War II, not as a flawless moral crusade, but as a human struggle marked by courage, fear, discipline, and failure existing side by side. Patton's response stands as an example of how leaders confronted actions that threatened the ethical framework of their armies, while remaining focused on the overriding objective of defeating Nazi Germany. As Allied forces pressed deeper into German territory after the crisis of the Ardennes, the questions raised by incidents like the execution of SS prisoners did not disappear, but instead became part of a quieter internal reckoning within the US Army during World War II. Commanders understood that the closer the war moved toward Germany itself, the more frequently soldiers would encounter enemy units steeped in ideology and desperation, conditions that made restraint increasingly difficult to enforce. Patton's emphasis on speed and relentless pressure meant that his army rarely paused long enough for extensive investigations, yet the command climate he fostered still reinforced the expectation that soldiers were representatives of a professional force rather than a vengeful mob. This distinction mattered deeply to senior leaders who believed that the legitimacy of American power in World War II rested as much on conduct as on battlefield success. Training directives circulated during this period increasingly reminded officers of their responsibility to maintain control over prisoners and civilians alike. These reminders were not abstract legal lectures, but practical warnings that breakdowns in discipline could spiral rapidly, endangering both missions and lives. World War II had shown repeatedly that uncontrolled violence often invited retaliation and stiffened enemy resistance. Within Third Army, the memory of SS atrocities continued to shape attitudes at the lowest levels. Soldiers spoke among themselves about Malmedy and other killings, stories that were retold and sometimes exaggerated as they moved from unit to unit. World War II rumor networks operated faster than official bulletins, and they influenced behavior in ways commanders struggled to counter. Patton was acutely aware of this psychological undercurrent. He recognized that fear and anger could become operational variables, affecting how soldiers reacted under fire. His solution was not sympathy, but structure, insisting that obedience and aggression be channeled through command rather than personal impulse, a philosophy that underpinned his leadership throughout World War II. The broader Allied command also monitored such incidents closely, concerned about how German propaganda might exploit them. Nazi media had already portrayed Allied forces as brutal invaders, and any verified executions of prisoners risked reinforcing that narrative. In World War II, information warfare ran parallel to battlefield combat, shaping perceptions far beyond the front. Legal officers within the army quietly tracked allegations of misconduct, creating records that might later be reviewed. These files were often incomplete, reflecting the chaos of wartime documentation, but their existence signaled an awareness that World War II would not end when the shooting stopped. Accountability, in some form, was expected to follow. For the soldiers who had carried out the executions, the war moved on with little pause for reflection. They returned to patrols, attacks, and defenses, absorbed once more into the relentless rhythm of combat. World War II rarely allowed space for moral contemplation at the individual level, especially during active operations. Patton's refusal to allow such incidents to disrupt momentum aligned with his belief that hesitation was more dangerous than controversy. He viewed the defeat of Germany as the ultimate moral imperative, one that demanded unwavering focus. In his mind, World War II would be judged first by its outcome, even as he understood that conduct would later come under scrutiny. As the spring of 1945 approached, Allied armies encountered the full extent of Nazi crimes in liberated camps and devastated cities. These discoveries reshaped perceptions of earlier incidents involving prisoner treatment. For many soldiers, confirmation of systematic murder by the regime they had been fighting hardened the belief that mercy toward SS units had been undeserved. World War II thus retroactively altered how events were emotionally interpreted, even if not legally justified. Patton himself reacted strongly to the liberation of camps, recording his disgust and anger in personal writings. These revelations reinforced his conviction that the enemy represented something fundamentally destructive. Yet even then, he did not publicly endorse unlawful retaliation, maintaining the formal distinction between hatred of an ideology and the discipline of an army in World War II. Historians examining this period note that Patton's behavior was not unique, but representative of a broader command culture that prioritized control without spectacle. Executions of prisoners were officially prohibited, but enforcement depended heavily on local conditions and leadership judgment. World War II forced armies to reconcile doctrine with reality on a daily basis. The absence of public trials or announcements regarding the SS executions reflects a deliberate choice to contain the issue. Leaders feared that open proceedings could inflame tensions, encourage copycat behavior, or undermine trust between officers and enlisted men. In the calculus of World War II, silence was sometimes viewed as the least damaging option. This silence, however, complicates historical understanding. Without clear records or outcomes, later generations are left piecing together fragments from diaries, letters, and oral histories. World War II thus remains a field where certainty is elusive and where moral clarity often gives way to ambiguity. Patton's role in this episode illustrates how leadership involved not only issuing orders but managing consequences. His response was neither passive nor overtly punitive, but calibrated to preserve authority under extreme strain. World War II demanded such calibration repeatedly as commanders navigated crises that defied simple solutions. The episode also raises enduring questions about responsibility. To what extent should commanders be held accountable for actions taken by soldiers under stress? World War II helped shape modern doctrines of command responsibility, but these doctrines were still evolving amid the conflict itself. As Allied victory became inevitable, attention slowly shifted toward reconstruction and justice. Plans for war crimes trials focused overwhelmingly on Axis leadership, leaving many lower-level incidents unexamined. World War II justice, like the war itself, was selective and shaped by political realities. For Patton, the end of the war did not bring resolution to these ethical tensions. His post-war statements continued to provoke controversy, reflecting a mindset forged in total war and uneasy with peacetime judgment. World War II had defined his worldview, leaving little room for moral simplicity. The execution of SS prisoners under his command remains one of many episodes that complicate his legacy. It does not fit neatly into narratives of heroism or villainy, instead revealing the burdens of command in a conflict that strained every moral boundary. By examining what Patton did when he learned of the executions, a clearer picture emerges of how World War II functioned at the highest levels of leadership. Decisions were rarely clean, outcomes were often imperfect, and authority was exercised within constraints imposed by chaos, fear, and urgency. In the months that followed Germany's surrender, the US Army began the complex process of demobilization, and with it came a quiet sorting of records, memories, and unresolved questions from World War II. Incidents that had been managed internally during combat were rarely revisited with the same urgency once victory was secured. The priority shifted toward bringing millions of soldiers home and stabilizing a shattered Europe. Patton remained in command during the early occupation period, where discipline took on a different meaning. The battlefield chaos that had framed earlier decisions was replaced by political oversight and diplomatic sensitivity. World War II had ended militarily, but its consequences were unfolding in a new form that demanded restraint rather than aggression. Within this environment, Patton's earlier handling of misconduct incidents, including the execution of SS prisoners, remained largely unexamined by higher authorities. There was little appetite for reopening cases that could complicate post-war unity or tarnish the image of a victorious army. World War II narratives were already being shaped, and they favored cohesion over introspection. Legal frameworks that would later govern armed conflict more strictly were still taking form. The Geneva Conventions existed, but enforcement mechanisms were uneven and often subordinated to political priorities. World War II exposed these gaps, revealing how laws struggled to keep pace with the scale and intensity of modern warfare. For soldiers who had lived through the Ardennes and beyond, memory itself became selective. Combat experiences blurred together, and moments of moral crisis were often buried beneath the relief of survival. World War II veterans carried these experiences quietly, shaped as much by what they did not speak about as by what they did. Patton's own post-war reflections rarely lingered on specific incidents of misconduct within his ranks. He framed the war in terms of movement, decisiveness, and command responsibility, concepts that aligned with his identity as a soldier rather than a moral arbiter. World War II, in his view, had been a test of will and action more than ethical theory. Historians later examining archival material noted how frequently serious incidents were referenced obliquely or omitted entirely. Reports focused on outcomes achieved rather than costs incurred. World War II documentation thus preserved a functional record of operations while leaving moral complexities fragmented across personal writings and secondary sources. The execution of SS prisoners under American control did not fit comfortably into the emerging post-war narrative of liberation. That narrative emphasized clear distinctions between perpetrators and victims, a framing that left little space for acknowledging Allied transgressions during World War II. As public attention turned toward the Nuremberg trials, the focus remained firmly on Nazi leadership and systemic crimes. These trials established crucial precedents for international law, but they also narrowed the lens through which wartime justice was viewed. World War II accountability became associated primarily with defeated enemies rather than victorious armies. Within military education, however, the lessons of discipline and control continued to be discussed. Staff colleges analyzed command decisions under stress, using anonymized case studies that reflected real events without naming them. World War II thus informed professional development even when specific incidents were not publicly acknowledged. Patton's command style was debated intensely in the years after the war. Admirers pointed to his effectiveness and speed, while critics questioned his temperament and judgment. The handling of incidents like prisoner executions became part of this broader reassessment, illustrating how leadership success and ethical risk were often intertwined in World War II. The soldiers who had carried out the executions returned to civilian life with little formal reckoning. Their actions were neither officially sanctioned nor prosecuted, existing instead in a gray zone shaped by circumstance and silence. World War II left many such zones unresolved, absorbed into the collective amnesia of peacetime transition. As Cold War tensions emerged, the United States military drew heavily on World War II experience to shape doctrine and values. Emphasis on professionalism, discipline, and adherence to law was reinforced, in part as a response to the moral ambiguities exposed during the war. Past incidents served as cautionary examples, even when not openly discussed. Patton's death in late 1945 froze his legacy in a particular moment. He could no longer clarify, defend, or reconsider his wartime decisions. World War II thus left behind a portrait of leadership defined as much by interpretation as by record. The ethical questions raised by the execution of SS prisoners remain relevant because they challenge simplified understandings of justice in war. They force a confrontation with the reality that extreme violence can distort judgment even among those fighting for legitimate causes. World War II made this distortion visible on a global scale. Modern historians approach such episodes with greater willingness to confront discomfort. Access to personal diaries, letters, and declassified reports allows a more nuanced view of how commanders like Patton navigated crises that offered no clean solutions. World War II scholarship continues to evolve as new perspectives are applied.